stresses that paragraph, and then the next paragraph, such an understanding of others, and then in summary, those 3 paragraphs. Okay, so what we want really is for you to comment on the referencing, on the citing. What practices do you see there? Is it in line with what we've been discussing? How effective do you think the writer has been in indicating which voice we're hearing, the writer's own voice? And then look at the use of language. Look at the verbs that the writer uses to report. Look at the tense. It's present tense, past tense, or future perfect, when you have and a past participle, those sorts of things. Okay. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I try and ignore that camera, but sometimes it's not a good idea to ignore it totally. You're looking at how the text works for you as a reader. And I think some of you are going to find that the text is a little bit iffy, surprisingly so. I chose these articles when I was doing the introduction stuff, and I just copied the whole thing so that I could use bits as we went through. I'm looking and I'm saying, oh my word, referencing. I'm not sure I really like this referencing, but anyway, so you are free to say if you don't like the referencing either. Shall we just do a sort of whistle-stop tour with some comments on each one? Shall we start with group 1? But you might have to just speak so that everybody can hear. Maybe if you sit on the desk or something and address that would be good.
Okay, so we discussed a few things. We're doing the knowledge management.
We're on page 1.
Page 1, right? So knowledge management, and we move across to the next page. But we'll get there. Okay, so we spoke about he sort of introduced what he's going to be talking about. He cited Serban and Luan and the 5 reasons for interest and so on is listed in, that's fine. The way he's done it, we don't have much of an issue with that. We welcome feedback. And then after that, for the rest of the paragraph, there's no references. Perhaps it's the same author, right, until the word therefore. But the thing is, there's many ideas coming in. And it might be the same author, it might be a different author. We're going to assume it's going to be the same. But the references just drop off.
Can I just chip in there? I think it is the same author,
yeah,
because if you look at what he's saying, it links to those 5 points.
Yeah.
But the problem for me as a reader was, I had to say, where is this coming from? Could it be? And then I had to start looking, okay, well now we've got information overload and chaos. Is there ability to find needed information? There's a word repeated there. I had to go through a whole mental process to understand, which is not really what you want to make your reader do. So how would you advise this author? If you were giving comments and you were saying, well, there's a problem there, in practical terms, what would you advise them to do?
I think, when they wrote it, maybe there wasn't an overlap of page, but reference a bit more. And I think there's new ideas after the listings. They've listed it, but they haven't given new ideas. So maybe if you're focusing on a particular idea, let the reader know that for the purpose of this paper, we're focusing on perhaps point A, information overload and growth in the field. And the rest is not really decided just for completeness, perhaps. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it.
One thing that he could have done, I think, because you don't want to have a citation, the same citation coming every sentence. That's horrible.
Yes.
You don't also want to have a citation at the end referring back to everything above, which some people do, but it doesn't work that way. Your citation only works for the sentence in which it occurs. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Only works for that sentence. So when people just put a citation at the end of a long paragraph and say, oh, but I cited, they've only cited the last sentence. It's just the convention. But now you as scholars are working within the conventions. But what he could have done, possibly, I haven't actually written this to see if it works, but something like he goes, and turnover, and E, competition. If he'd have started the next sentence thus, putting links, yes. If he'd have said thus, having the ability to find needed information, the thus links with what went before, which was cited. In addition, also, furthermore, all of those links would show that it was linking with the preceding sentence. So that is one way when you've got a whole zooming in onto somebody and you've got lots of things that you're wanting to paraphrase from a source. You need to think carefully about how to do this because you can't put in a citation in every sentence. Now the law students have it easier. Do you use footnoting? Maybe also you don't. If people footnote, you can put in little footnotes all over the place, and it doesn't get in the way of the reader. But Harvard, this author date referencing, is sitting in the text. So if you have too much of that, it becomes a problem to read. You saw even with that literature review that we looked at earlier. You know, sometimes you have to work quite hard to see how the syntax works because of the references. So you always have to be careful. That's why you can't have every sentence having one. So linking would be very important. Or you say up front, you know, the following discussion is drawn from Bloggs and Jones 2003. Then you know all the rest of the paragraph. You're actually paraphrasing from that source. So there are ways in which you can deal with a whole paragraph that you're drawing from source. Okay.
Then in the same paragraph, the author of this particular paper says, therefore, the continuous improvement. Immediately you can see that's the author's, what their view on what's being discussed. So that's okay in terms of no reference. Then there's various ways of classifying knowledge. It starts off with TILAC 2002 and speaks about that. Then it says table 1 illustrates the distinction between. Okay, it's referenced there, but if you look at the table itself, if you were looking just at the paper, there's no reference as a caption or anything within it, like on the table. So once you speak about it in text, it's not on the table, and I think that might be potentially issue.
That's well observed, yes, absolutely.
Okay. And then staying, if you look at the next paragraph, it's pretty long as well. There's staying 2004 and staying 2003. So there's clearly two references here. Where's the border between the two? Where does one reference end and the next reference start? It's open to the interpretation of the reader. It might not be the best way to go about it, right? And formatting wise, Hansen, Morris, and Lovas, I think there should be an ampersand, but that's
a style.
It depends on the style, yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the style guide of the journal.
And then the last part, perceived competition within and amongst teams. Is that a new idea? I don't think so. I think that's also from the author, but maybe because of the length of the paragraph, it's just something we looked at. Yeah. Should there be a reference there? Perhaps. Perhaps it should, because it's a totally different idea of drawing from the page. So yeah, that's essentially our approach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think there are problems here with the citing. It's not always clear. Remember, I said that's sort of like the bottom line thing. You need to always make clear to your reader what the source of the idea is. And it's difficult when we're writing because we know. So it's difficult to see as the reader sees. Hence, we're doing this exercise now because what you need to do with your own writing is to try and put on the reader's hat and say, am I making clear to my reader what the source of this is? And of course, time does help. If you put stuff away and then come back to it to look at it again, it does help. Whereas if you write something and immediately try and edit it, it doesn't work so well because you know what you sort of perceive what you expect, really. Whereas if you put a bit of distance between yourself and your text. Okay, that was nice. Do you two want to tell us what next one? Oh, you guys, page 12. We're just going to look at page 12, the organizational culture. I hope yours is as pale.
For that part of organizational culture, there is maybe you can think that maybe the author has a bit of authority in the area, or if not, it hasn't done much of any reference, because just bits and pieces of the references, but most of it is basically his voice, right? Which for me, I don't think it's right. That's a different suggestion of that. Because what I do see is that he presents his own voice, then gets down to actually now show the root of thought by saying, okay, now this was actually now said by this person.
Okay, so you think there isn't sufficient citing here. So you think he's using concepts and ideas from the text. If you just read the beginning, in this article, organizational culture is defined as the perceptions of the character of an organization by its employees. That's definitely his own voice, isn't it? The individual perceptions combine to create the collective organizational culture. If the culture is collaborative, then knowledge sharing amongst employees should be occurring. However, a lack of important enablers such as rewards or the presence of noticeable barriers may inhibit a sharing culture, and then he referenced that. So presumably it could be his voice saying, as you say, maybe there is coming from his expertise. He's asserting if the culture is collaborative, then knowledge sharing should be. That seems like something that somebody in the field could generally understand, I would think. And then he talks about this particular scholar as asserted by Richa. It is thus critical to identify the barriers in order to remove them so that knowledge sharing may become common culture of the relevant organization. And then he goes into the next source, identified 4 functions of organizational culture. Yes, that's quite interesting there, because you see how he's used the punctuation to show that all of this derives from the same source. Because he uses a colon and then he lists them. So he doesn't have to cite again because of the way he's punctuated. A colon and then those various sentences separated by semicolons. So it's perfectly clear to us that it's this source that he's referring to. And then look at his voice coming through. I think you're right when you say there seems to be a sense of expertise here. He says this highlights the fact that that's his voice coming through there. That variables such as leadership and organizational culture are interdependent. So he's taken the discussion from the sources and now he's come to some sort of conclusion and pointing it up as being important. Now, what I thought was interesting here was, I don't know whether you picked this up as being his voice or the voice of the source, Campbell, because he's done exactly what I was saying, thus, similarly, etc. To me, that looked as if all of that comes from the source, and that using those linking words is showing that he's still reporting the source. Campbell pointed out that thus, by focusing similarly by acknowledging. That all to me seems to indicate that it's related to the source.
Then what about the last sentence of that same page, page 13, Campbell, where it starts with the point B driven by the researchers. Does that really kind of like point out to himself referring to what is prior?
Exactly. So he's taking the researchers and now he's distilling what he thinks is the point. The important thing that they all have in common, that they're all driving towards. So he's actually doing this effectively because his voice is coming through, he's making assertions, and he's selecting and reflecting on what he's, the ideas of the other sources, and then he makes the point for himself. Is although social factors like collaboration and trust were not found to be significant, they are nevertheless important, etc. Okay, thanks. So I definitely agree with you. There's a sense of expertise coming through here because we do hear his voice quite clearly. You were looking at the learning organization. I don't know whether there was anything in particular you wanted to comment on that, or it's very similar. page 13. Can I just say on page 13, the second paragraph, go 2002, page 23. Page reference there because he quotes the term knowledge transfer as a key dimension of the learning organization and hence as a critical factor for knowledge management. Then he says one of the methods used for knowledge transfer by learning organizations is that of initiating communities of practice. That's the writer's voice because he wants to get from the notion about knowledge transfer to communities of practice. So he is making a link there, bringing in the notion of communities of practice, and then he draws on a source as evidence and to expand on the notion of communities of practice. So he's working there to develop the field using the sources as evidence for what he's saying, but he's creating those links between knowledge transfer and then communities of practice as a means of knowledge transfer. And then if you look at the next little bit, then we've got the reference Cross, Borgatti and Parker. Then he begins Kimball and Hildreth, 2005, page 103, concurred. Considering communities of practice as groups of people who are joined together with an internal motivation and common purpose. Key to this group of people. Now, as soon as you read that, key to this group of people, you know he's still talking about what comes from the source, because he talked about group of people. Now he's repeating very clearly this group of people. That was the problem I had with that first one, that it seemed to be about, and it used some of the key terms. But here, it's very clear. He says, this group of people. So it gives a very clear link back to the previous sentence, and so it seems it's easy for the reader to understand this as being okay. All right, what do you think is the difference in effect if you make your citation part of your sentence or if you just cite in a bracket?
We discussed this.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, share it with us.
Essentially, what we discussed is if you start off a sentence with so and so 2000 and whatever said this, you're foregrounding that author, right? So they are a main player in your literature. But if somebody is just supporting an argument, you put them at the end in brackets. That's sort of what we discussed.
Okay. Nice. It also allows you to maybe spend more time. If you're going to sort of spend a lot of time looking at the ideas of one person, then you foreground them and then you expand on it. Whereas if you're going to put a lot of citations together, then obviously it's much neater to do it at the end. Yes, so there are strategies linked with your choice of whether it's a sort of internal to the sentence or whether it's just external to the sentence. Okay, sure. I think we're getting late. Was there anything that the group there? I don't want to kind of leave you out. Was there anything different from what we've talked about that you noticed in your passage that you'd like to draw us attention to? Just give us the page.
It's on page 17.
Page 17. Okay.
Yes. The citation with original page numbers.
Yeah.
And where there is the page number, there is no year of publication.
Okay, so give us a paragraph. Oh, I see here. In the paragraph that begins, such an understanding of others.
And
That's interesting. What does that page 161 refer to?
just page 161 with no year of
Yes,
publication.
but if you look at that sentence, it started off Olsen and Olsen state that in awareness, and then because they quoted, they put that is an acceptable style. You could have said Olsen and Olsen 2000, page 161, or you could put page 61 at the end. It's a different style. Yeah. Okay, well observed. That's actually really nice, because this is what we want to do. We want to pick up all these different ways of doing things. Thank you.
Just quickly on that, the other thing in that particular section, the voice is signaled very clearly by saying we.
Yes.
There's no doubt as to whose voice is on the way.
Yes.
And then the other thing that I spotted there that interested me is when they reference each sentence, I think the last paragraph. And it's okay, we know it's Burford and it gets very staccato. You can just have the references.
Which page?
On 17, the last paragraph.
The last paragraph, yeah.
They had the same.
Yes, that could bear sort of recrafting, I think, because it is irritating if you keep on giving the same reference. So you could say something like Benford and Farland, discuss the virtual environment, and then you could talk about it. They go on to say that. There are ways in which you can link things together. So the they refers back to the previous sentence and the citation there. So those are important things to note in your writing. When you're polishing up your draft, and when you're putting on your reader's hat and saying, how does this work for the reader? It irritates the reader. Not a good thing. It confuses the reader. Not a good thing. It misleads the reader. Not a good thing. Okay. All right. The one that I gave you see, there's a nice example of a model, the separate one that comes from a dissertation. There's a nice example of a model on page 45, it is, in the original, where it's cited. And you see the citation there, Porter, 1985, page 65. So just like a quotation, it is cited there. And if you look back at page 44, this is exactly an example of what you were talking about the past tense used for when you're referring to sort of methodological things. Empirical research carried out by, all right, because the research was carried out in the past, so now we're going to use the past tense. And then we've got criticizes the expectation. So the research was carried out, but the research as a publication still criticizes. So you use the present tense there. So that's a very nice example of exactly the principle that you were telling us. And just look at that little paragraph. They talk about the empirical research. It criticizes this expectation. Rather than believe this expectation, many authors believe. Now, as soon as you see many authors, as soon as I see many authors, I think, which authors? Yes, where's the list? And there's the list. You see at the end of the sentence. Very good. A whole long list of them. And because he has said many, he has to give a reasonable number to show that this is actually quite generally said. So that's why quite a large number of citations there. In these works, the authors emphasize the theoretical advantages of hybrid approaches to explaining the emergence of clicks and mortar strategies in the past year. Now that's interesting, because then he's got Lindsay 1999. What do you think he's citing here? Because he says in these works the authors emphasize, which sounds like his voice, doesn't it? So what is he citing for Lindsay? Do you think it might be the use of the term clicks and mortars? Yeah. Okay. And it's quite interesting, you notice there, clicks and mortar, he's got double inverted commas, and then he's got single inverted commas. Now I'm wondering, is this a strategy? Because very often if you're using double inverted commas for quotations, then you should have a page number for Lindsay to say where clicks and mortar came from. And then presumably, I'm assuming it could be that he uses single in the next paragraph because he's now talking about it as a concept. So it's not a quotation anymore, it's a concept. Clicks and mortar strategies, it's a concept. So that's very often a distinction. Double for quoted words, single for a concept that you're using. But I do think there's a problem there because he hasn't actually put in the page reference, although the punctuation seems to indicate that that's a quotation. But he's put this together really nicely because look, he goes on to clicks and mortar, option offers an advantage in areas of business where there's his voice. He's saying something. And then he backs it up with a citation from Hansen to say what are these advantages, these assets, etc., etc. And then he also has some further information about web-based businesses, about advantages from Wiegand. And then he starts to further understand these advantages. A framework can be derived. And he's talking about all the theories, and he indicates that the framework is put together by Porter. So he's using the sources, but he's putting it together to show where Porter is getting all his ideas from. Okay. All right, I think that's kind of pretty much more of the same. Any final comments? Questions, queries? Okay. Well, I hope that we have covered some of the issues. I think we have actually looked at all the things that we talked about as being, perhaps we saw as challenges in the beginning. Depth and breadth, we've said it has to be there. We didn't really look at quality of sources because we don't really have access to this as, well, certainly I don't, as not being a member of the field. But I think everything else I hope we've addressed in a way to give you something to think about going forward.
Can I ask you something? Like here on page 44, you've mentioned all the
Okay, sorry, we're looking at page 44 again.
After mentioning this, maybe like your authors,
Yes.
your authors have like a common understanding or common view. Is it important to unpack each and every author's view?
No, not if
in
you're
the literature?
not
Like
if you're saying that it's common.
it's common.
You see what you're doing, it's like the camera.
So it may be common, but when you read each view, each author's view, it might
It's
be
obviously going to different.
different.
But what
Element.
this writer is doing is saying there is a common element. So
yes.
he's kind of stepping back, looking at a lot of sources and saying, these are the commonalities that I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you don't have to unpack what's each.
Only if it's going to be of help to your to where you want to go. He doesn't want to focus on the differences. He wants to focus on the commonalities.
Oh, I see.
Presumably because he's talking about the advantages. So, and this is what they all say in common is the advantages. So he doesn't want to go into somebody saying, well, this may be a disadvantage, but on the whole, there seems to be, he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to muddy the water. For him, the point he's trying to make is that there are advantages and that clicks and mortar option is a good way to go. So that's the strategy I would think. Okay.
So it depends on your strategy, where you want to.
Yes, exactly.